Boldwood presents The Widow, written by Valerie Keogh and read by Rose Robinson. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Part 1. Chapter 1. My parents loved each other. They were always hugging, holding hands, touching. If separated in a crowd, they'd exchange passionately adoring glances. Parted by distance, they'd pine and make frequent phone calls. They rarely used their given names, the plain John and Eve everyone else used. Instead it was darling, honey, sweetheart, and other various nicknames, the most nauseating of which was sex bomb for her, stud for him. These last only used in the privacy of their home, where I lived. Their love was exclusive, inward-looking, nothing remaining for anyone else, not even the children these self-obsessed people had brought into the world. The children they'd named Allison, Beth, and Cassie, but dismissively referred to as A, B, and C, or, as I overheard my mother calling us once, the alphabet Sprogs. We weren't mistreated. Not really. Hard to mistreat someone you barely acknowledge being alive. We offspring of these two were fed and clothed, but little money was spent on procuring either. Our eyes were opened when we went to school, and, as the eldest of the three Sprogs, I was first to suffer for the sin of being different. I was the child the other children laughed at. My thin, spindly body clothed in well-worn, badly fitting charity shop clothes. The child who, from self-preservation, became a skilled, believable liar. Lies to save face. The ones when I insisted I wasn't hungry as classmates unwrapped their lunchtime sandwiches. My mother's attitude being, if I didn't want to eat the meagre bread and jam provided free by the school, I could do without. Jam sandwiches. No butter so that the bread was soggy, the resultant mess unappetizing. Maybe I'd have eaten it, hungry as I was, if taking one of those vile offerings hadn't pushed me further down in the already low estimation of my classmates. Lies to protect me from my mother's ire when a teacher asked if I'd eaten breakfast the morning I fainted. Even at a young age, I was aware that although my parents didn't care about their children, they did care about how they were perceived by authority. Lies to cover my petty thieving. The bars of chocolate, packets of crisps, anything I could slip into my pockets or my scuffed, raggedy school bag. I was the child other children laughed at. The child who gazed about her and wondered why her life was so incredibly sad. Chapter 2. Allison met Peter at a party given by Lorraine, a work colleague she wasn't particularly friendly with. The invitation was unexpected, and Allison, who wasn't keen on social gatherings of any sort, and work ones in particular, desperately searched for an acceptable excuse to avoid an event where she'd have to make small talk with people she wasn't keen on. "It's my 40th. Do come, it'll be fun." Lorraine, clipboard in one hand, a pen in the other with its point pressed to the space beside Allison's name, gave an impatient huff as she waited for an answer. Guessing she'd been invited to make up the numbers rather than any real desire to have her company, Allison wanted to say an unvarnished no. She didn't owe Lorraine anything. They weren't friends. But, unable to think of a good enough excuse, she found herself nodding and spouting lies. "Of course, thank you. I'd love to come." For the remainder of the day, all kinds of acceptable reasons to refuse popped into her head. Too late, as these things usually were. It was a week to the party, and she'd promised herself she'd find an opportunity to tell Lorraine she couldn't, after all, make it, that something unexpected had come up and how genuinely sorry she was. But the week had flown by, and a chance to tell her, even if Allison could have found the words, never occurred. The night of the party, she took out a dress she'd bought months before and never worn. It had been in the window of an expensive boutique she regularly passed on her way to work. Her social life being non-existent, there was no requirement for fancier clothes than the rather dull suits she bought in M&S, so she'd never gone inside. But on a particularly grey morning, the colour of the dress had caught her eye, a shade of turquoise she associated with the tantalising seascapes on the covers of holiday brochures. She'd stood staring at it as busy commuters surged by, then turned to join the flow, trying to put it from her mind. It was a busy day, with little time for daydreaming, but now and then, just for a few seconds, she allowed her mind to drift to the dress. A woman wearing such a divine garment couldn't be dull. She'd be dazzling, oozing charm. Her conversation would be sparkling and witty. She'd be everything Allison wasn't. Everything she longed to be. It was a Thursday night. Late-night shopping. When she left the office for home that evening, the streets were heaving with shoppers who ploughed onward, laden carrier bags bumping into others willy-nilly as they passed. Allison slowed as she approached the boutique, half afraid the dress would be gone, half hoping it would be. If it was still there, she might go inside. Try it on. Not buy it, of course. She'd know where to wear a dress so elegant. It was there. She stood with her nose almost pressed to the traffic-dusty glass of the shop window. The dress was more lovely than she remembered. An absolute longing consumed her. There was no harm in going inside to look at it, was there? The interior of the shop was large and lavishly decorated with gold trimmings. The only assistant, a short, attractive woman who moved about on towering stilettos as if floating, was busy with a customer who was holding up a dress in 2 different shades, as if trying to decide which to purchase. Conscious the suit she was wearing had seen better days, Allison resisted the temptation to hug the large satchel she carried to her chest like a shield. Instead, overcompensating, she swung it in what she hoped was nonchalance, praying it didn't look as odd as she feared. When neither the assistant nor the other customer as much as glanced in her direction, she relaxed and looked around. Dresses were hanging on a rail on the far side of the shop. As she crossed, her footsteps on the polished wooden floor seeming over-loud, she scanned the collection, hoping the dress in the window wasn't the only one. No, there it was. She reached out to touch it, fingers skimming over the fabric. The colours were more vibrant up close, the material soft and light. She held the skirt of the dress out, picturing herself in it, the fabric swishing round her legs. With a sigh, she let it drop. She didn't need such a dress, but it didn't stop her searching for the price tag. Perhaps if it weren't too expensive. But it was. Ludicrously expensive, in fact. The assistant was still busy. Allison could simply leave and put this nonsense behind her. Her fingers, however, had other ideas and reached out to touch the dress again. Then, suddenly, she had the hanger off the rail and she was crossing the shop floor with it in her hand. After all, it cost nothing to try it on, did it? But when Allison tried it on, when she twirled and admired her reflection in the triad of mirrors that formed the back walls of the small changing room, when she saw how the dress transformed her from dull to scintillating, she knew she had to have it. "How is it?" the assistant asked through the thin curtain of the changing room. Allison nodded at her reflection. "It's perfect. I'll take it." The dress had sat in her wardrobe, unworn, in the months since she'd bought it. Now and then she'd take it out, getting pleasure from the sheer gorgeousness of it. Reluctant as she was to attend Lorraine's birthday celebrations, it was an opportunity to wear it. On the night of the party, Allison hung the dress on the outside of the wardrobe door. An unexpected excitement edged away any lingering reluctance and pushed her into making more of an effort. Normally, she pinned her long brown hair up, a tight chignon for work, a low ponytail at the weekend. That night, she allowed it to dry naturally rather than blow-drying it, and gentle waves framed her face before falling to her shoulders. Against the turquoise fabric of the dress, her hair looked more auburn than mousy brown. Reaching for her usual makeup, she hesitated. For years, she'd applied the same heavy foundation, eyeshadow, lipstick. It had become as much part of her work uniform as her M&S suits. She ran her fingers over the smattering of freckles on her cheeks. Perhaps that night, she'd go au naturel, with maybe just a flick of mascara and a touch of lipstick. She stared at herself in the mirror, pleased with the results. She looked like someone else. Even better, she felt like someone else. The woman from her imagination, the one who dazzled. The woman she could have been had she made different choices all those years before. Chapter 3. The party was held in the small upstairs function room of a pub near King's Cross Station. Allison had been inside it years before, not long after she'd joined Macpherson Accountancy, and had been eager to fit in. It had been a work night out to celebrate something or other. The reason had long since slipped her memory. The group had quickly descended into drunken bawdiness, and she'd made her exit as quickly as possible, swearing never again. She hadn't socialised with her colleagues again, and the memory of the previous debacle swamped the excitement of her dress. It would be better to go home, and perhaps she would have done if the door of the pub hadn't suddenly opened and a laughing group surged out. Their laughter released some of the tension that had gripped her. What harm could it do to go in for one drink? Inside, it was busy, and groups of raucous drinkers with brimming pint glasses stood between her and the door to the narrow stairway that led to the upstairs venue. She dodged around them, one hand holding the skirt of her dress tightly to her body. Her phew of relief was lost in the din as she pushed the door open and went through. The stairway was dimly lit. From the bottom, she could see the startlingly bright lights of the landing, and, as if lured, she climbed slowly. At the top, she stopped, taking stock, girding her loins. She smiled at the thought. It was a party, not a battle. It was supposed to be fun. Through double doors, she saw a crowd of people milling about, laughing and talking. They were obviously enjoying themselves. She could walk over, crack a joke, smile, laugh, be just like them. They were no different to her, were they? Not on the surface, anyway. She slipped past the doors and followed a sign on the wall to the ladies, relieved on reaching it to find she had it to herself. The facilities were surprisingly generous. An ornately framed mirror hung over each of the 3 wash-hand basins, with a matching full-length one fixed to the wall at the end. On one side of this sat 2 velvet-covered chairs angled to face each other. They offered a comfortable place to sit. Perhaps she could simply stay there. Lorraine was bound to come in at some stage during the evening. Allison could sit on one of the chairs, wait till she did, say hello, wish her a happy birthday, and make her exit. She could. The lighting in the room was flattering. Allison smoothed a hand down the fabric of her dress and walked towards the full-length mirror. It was exactly as she'd imagined she'd look. It hadn't transformed her into the life and soul of the party, but she looked glamorous, attractive, and like other women she'd admired who were dressed up for a night of excitement. Not a woman who came to a party to hide in the toilets. Allison was a grown woman, an accountant, not a child. Plus, it was a bloody expensive dress. Showing it off would go somewhere toward justifying the ridiculous amount of money she'd paid for it. When she returned to the landing, there was a group of people heading into the venue. She didn't recognize anyone, but tagged along with the laughing group until they were inside, where the noise was slightly louder than it had been downstairs in the pub. A few people were gyrating on the small dance floor, hands pumping the air with enthusiasm in time to the beat of a song Allison didn't recognize. She looked around for the birthday girl but couldn't see her in the crowd. When her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light inside the room, she recognized a couple of people from the office. They raised their hands in greeting when they saw her, but made no effort to invite her to join them. A rising tide of red crept over her cheeks, her eyes flicking to the doorway as panic's icy fingers gripped and squeezed. There were so many people between her and the exit. She wasn't sure she could make it. "Allison!" Lorraine appeared at her side, a drink in one hand, a party horn in the other. She blew it next to Allison's ear, almost deafening her. "I really didn't think you'd come." Alcohol slurred the edges of her words. "You didn't come to the Christmas party, so I'm honoured." She waved an arm around the room, swaying alarmingly. "You know everyone. Grab a drink." Another expansive wave pointed towards where a table was set up with glasses and bottles. "It's free till it runs out," she giggled drunkenly, "which won't be long at the rate everyone is drinking, so grab a glass while you can." Another blow on the party horn and she left. Allison's panic had faded. Her duty had been done. The birthday girl had seen her. She didn't want a drink. She could leave. The music changed to a song she liked, a George Michael one she hadn't heard for a while. With a shrug, she headed to the drinks table, humming along to Faith. She might as well stay for one drink. The white linen-covered table was festooned with birthday banners and helium balloons. It had probably looked jaunty and festive at the beginning of the night, but now, only an hour into the party, it was looking bedraggled. The biggest of the banners was torn in two. Two of the balloons had been untied and were bouncing lazily along the ceiling. To add a touch of gothic horror, red wine dripped ghoulishly down one side of the white linen. A waiter stood behind a table. The uniform waistcoat he wore had obviously been purchased many years, and a couple of stone, before. The small metal buttons that fastened it strained against the buttonholes and looked ready to pop at any moment. She imagined them firing into the crowd, making the drunks bleed. He looked and sounded bored. "What can I get you?" The choice seemed limited to white, red, or beer. "A glass of white wine, please." Maybe he was in a hurry to finish the free drinks, or perhaps he didn't know any better because the glass he handed her was filled to the brim. Wine trickled down the outside as he passed it to her. As she hesitated, she caught him looking, a smile hovering just out of reach. He probably thought she was too precious to take it. She wasn't, but she was conscious of her dress. "You can put it down, thanks." When he did, she used an edge of the table covering to dry the glass before lifting it carefully to take a mouthful. Only then did she move away with it in her hand, searching for a place where she could stand without looking conspicuously alone. Lorraine was wrong. She didn't know everyone. In fact, apart from the few people from the office she'd already seen, nobody looked familiar. Or maybe, like her, they'd taken off their work masks. Maybe if she downed a few glasses of this bloody awful cheap plonk, she'd be able to relax. Let go. Maybe join the group on the dance floor and sway in time to the music playing now, a song she remembered from her university days but couldn't put a name to. She hadn't liked parties then any more than she did now. But back then, she and her equally nerdy friends would dance anywhere. The words came to her, and she sang along under her breath, shimmying in time to the music. Lost in the moment, she wasn't aware of the man who appeared at her shoulder until she felt the warmth of his breath on her cheek as he leaned closer to be heard above the surrounding noise. "I've always liked this song too." Startled, she jerked around, her lips suddenly within kissing distance of a handsome stranger who was looking at her with an admiring glint in his eyes. Allison took a step away and lifted her glass to her mouth, taking a gulp rather than a sip, her mouth dry. She hoped he'd think the colour in her cheeks was the result of alcohol, not embarrassment. Or, if she was being completely honest, the unaccustomed, overwhelming dart of desire. Small talk wasn't her forte. She was great with numbers, above averagely useless with words. "How do you know Lorraine?" An open question, she'd read, was better at promoting interaction. "I don't." As a conversation ender, it was perfect. She stared at him, willing her brain to come up with something scintillating to say. It didn't, but it wouldn't have mattered. Her tongue was suddenly large and clumsy in her mouth, refusing to work. "I don't know anyone here." He put a warm hand on her elbow and led her away as they were crushed by a huddle of people attempting to reach the drinks table. "I suppose you'd call me a gatecrasher." A drunken roar from the dance floor drew their attention. Allison felt the heat of his hand on her elbow. She should pull away, glare at him for taking liberties. But she wanted him to stay, to keep his hand exactly where it was. It was times like this she wished for a Cyrano to slip her the right words, a quick, sassy comment to make this incredibly handsome man look at her in admiration, be enthralled by her, want to stay. By the time the noise level had dropped again, she hadn't thought of anything better to say than a very lame and not very complimentary, "Why on earth would you want to gatecrash this party?" She pulled her arm away from his hand. The patch of skin he'd touched was instantly chilled. She rubbed her hand over it. It was time to leave. This man, with his well-cut suit, a glint of gold in the cuffs of his shirt, his tie undone just enough. He was out of her league. Previous boyfriends, and there had been many, had been those who, like her, lurked on the edges of whatever was going on. This man belonged centre stage. "I was in the bar downstairs with some work colleagues when I saw you come in." He reached forward, and before she could stop him, he'd gathered a fold of her dress in his hand. "You stood out in this amidst all the dull suits and black dresses." He dropped the material and raised his hand to her hair. "Your hair caught the light. I was curious about you, so I followed." She wanted to laugh, to dismiss him as an opportunist, a scam artist, one of those men who preyed on desperate or vulnerable women. Perhaps she would have done, if he hadn't taken her hand and looked into her eyes with such intensity she felt weak. She'd sneered at women who fell for such obvious tricks. How desperate they must have been. "Why don't we get out of here and go somewhere we can talk?" She wasn't desperate or vulnerable. She was an intelligent, mature woman who had no desire to become a statistic. But when he reached for her hand, she laid hers in his and went with him, like a lamb to the sacrificial altar. Chapter 4. I learnt to read when I was very young, and quickly discovered a fantasy world where everything was bright and cheerful, where children were loved and cosseted by adoring parents. I would read the words, greedy for this imaginary world, reluctant to leave it, rereading my favourite stories, finishing the last page, turning immediately to the first page again, reliving a life so unlike mine. Perhaps stories would have been sufficient if a new student hadn't joined our class when I was almost 9. She was small, mousy, nothing special, although she was adopted, which caused a few minutes of staring, as if being such meant she had to look different in some way. When she didn't, we went back to ignoring her. Things wouldn't have changed if I hadn't walked out after school that first day to see her mother waiting for her with open arms. There was a beaming smile and a look of love on her face as she folded the mousy girl in her embrace as if she was the most precious thing in the world. Jealousy was a new emotion for me. It brought me to a halt, my eyes fixed on the scene, wanting desperately to be that girl, to have that woman as my mother, to have the life I knew I should have been born into. The girl, Monica, became my obsession. Never a friend, though. Losers like me, girls who didn't have lunch, who never invited classmates to birthday parties, who were dressed in charity shop cast-offs, who were obviously different, didn't have friends. Even then, I knew my place. But I watched. I followed Monica and her mother home, stood outside their house for hours at a time, and followed their comings and goings. Perhaps I wanted to see that the reality of their life was no different to mine, that the school greeting was merely for show. But no, they appeared happy, content, loved up every single time I saw them. My envy grew, especially when I had to go home after seeing them together, when I was forced to contrast their idyllic life with mine. Why couldn't I have been adopted into a loving family? That thought began to obsess me until finally I realized that I could be. If my parents were to die. Chapter 5. Peter took Allison to a wine bar a short distance away. The clientele, older, smarter, richer. The decor sumptuous. Damask chairs, polished wood, the light dim and flattering. This is better. He brushed away the menu the waiter held out to him. A bottle of Dom Perignon, please. Certainly. Allison bit back a sigh of pleasure as she sat on a chair so comfortable it was like being hugged. She was being swept along. It wasn't a sensation she was used to. You didn't ask if I liked champagne. Do you? Yes, but that isn't the point. She tried to put a little steel in her voice. I don't even know your name. He laughed then, the confident, self-assured sound of a man who always got his own way. Peter Fellows. Are you happier drinking champagne with me now? Once again, she wanted to dazzle him with her witty repartee. Safer, perhaps. Safer, perhaps. That was the best she could come up with. It may not have been scintillating, but it made him laugh anyway. You think knowing my name makes it safer? I could be lying to you. Are you? Instead of answering, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Here you go. He handed a business card across. The card was thick, matte black, the writing in gold script. Peter Fellows, attorney at law. I'm not sure this makes me feel safer. This drew another laugh. Perhaps she wasn't that bad at snappy retorts after all. The arrival of the champagne and the palaver of opening it gave Allison time to assess the man sitting opposite with a more objective eye. He was certainly handsome, reminding her a little of a young Paul Newman. Brown eyes, though, not blue. Lighter brown hair, cut a little too short for her taste. Large hands with slightly stubby fingers. No wedding band. No indent to say one had been there recently. All almost too perfect. A discreet pop brought her eyes back to the waiter, who performed the ritual opening and poured with a minimum of fuss. When he left, Peter picked up his glass and held it forward. "Here's to auspicious beginnings." Beginnings? The bubbles tickled her nose as she sipped. Then, throwing caution to the winds that were whirling around her, ones filled with dazzling opportunities, she took a large mouthful. She didn't drink much. Wine if she was out for dinner, the occasional glass at home in the evening. Maybe the unaccustomed alcohol was responsible for the feeling of lightness, the huge sense of expectation. "I want to know all about you," Peter said, putting his glass down. "Starting with your name." It would have been nice to have talked of some fascinating life spent in various parts of the world, a childhood in India, teenage years in South Africa, university in Boston. She could have invented a believable past if she'd had warning. Without it, it was easier to go with a version of the truth. "There's not much to say. My name's Allison, I'm from Oxford. Went to university in Southampton, then studied to be an accountant here in London." "And you still work here?" She was tempted to say yes and name one of the more reputable accountancy firms, any of the ones who'd considered her not good enough. Not her qualifications. Her. Each of the rejection letters had contained a variation on, "You're not quite what we were looking for." She still brooded over those rejections, worried that they'd seen something in her that wasn't quite right. It was dangerous to lie about where she worked, though. London could be a small city when it came to certain professions. "Yes." She waited for him to ask who she worked for, preparing herself for his disdainful expression when she mentioned the bargain basement company Macpherson Accountancy. He didn't ask. Instead, he rubbed his hand across his forehead in pantomime relief, adding a "whew" in case she might have misunderstood, or perhaps he doubted his acting skills. "Good. I was afraid maybe you were here for a conference or something and would vanish to some far-flung part of the country." Relief that he didn't ask where she worked vied with irritation that he hadn't been interested enough to do so. She brushed aside both and smiled. "Only as far as Tottenham." "You weren't tempted to commute from Oxford to be near your family?" Allison longed for the day when that one word, family, didn't send a frisson of fear and loathing down her spine. For what she'd done. For what she was. She finished the champagne to wash the sensation away. "I don't have anyone there anymore." The waiter, as if pulled by an invisible string, appeared and topped up her glass. Not Peter's, she noticed. He'd barely touched his. She should have stopped when she noticed his abstinence. Certainly shouldn't have drunk the second glass even faster. Whether it was the bubbles or the intense regard of the man sitting opposite, she became unusually talkative. "My parents died in an accident several years ago." He leaned towards her, his expression suddenly somber. "I'm so sorry. That must have been tough. Do you have siblings?" She lifted her glass and took a large mouthful. He was waiting for her answer. She shrugged. "No, I'm an only child." "Tough and lonely." He sat back, but his eyes never left her face. "I think only children are more resilient and become self-contained from necessity. I've always been content with my own company." She dropped her eyes to her glass, watching as the bubbles rose and vanished. "I have friends, of course." A lie. She had one friend, Portia, who Allison had met only recently. Otherwise, there were a few acquaintances who invited her to the occasional party to make up the numbers, or who rang when they were bored and nobody else was free. Another bottle?" The waiter looked at Peter as he emptied the last of the champagne into a glass. Allison wanted to take umbrage at the waiter's deference to Peter. Wanted to raise a hand and say with cool disdain that, yes, they'd have another bottle. But she'd drunk most of the champagne and was afraid the words would come out slurred, perhaps even garbled, rather than firm and authoritative. So she said nothing, relieved when Peter shook his head. When the bill came, presented to him on a silver salver, she made a half-hearted objection. "I should pay. I think I drank most of it." "Don't be silly. You're here at my invitation." Dom Perignon. In a place like this. She was slightly annoyed by his "don't be silly," but more than happy to be spared the cost. "Thank you." She picked up her handbag. "I should be getting home." "I have my car parked close by. I'll drop you back." Strangely relieved to have his abstinence explained, she shook her head. "No, that's fine, thank you. I can call a taxi." "Nonsense." She should have been irritated at his dismissal of her decision, but when she got to her feet and felt the floor swaying under her, she was inordinately grateful. If she hoped he wouldn't notice, she was enlightened when he laughed and put a hand on her waist. "You're a lightweight," he said, pulling her closer to him. He was solid, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress. It was the excess alcohol that made her melt into him, that allowed her to be led along. And, once again, she thought of the sacrificial lamb being led to the slaughter. But who was leading whom? Because suddenly, she thought Peter could be exactly what she needed. Chapter 6. It had been her friend Portia who'd inadvertently given Allison the idea. They'd met at yoga, quickly discovering they had a similar dismissive, cynical attitude towards those for whom the perfect bird of paradise pose was a raison d'etre. Allison was between boyfriends. Boyfriends. She called them that, although they were rarely more than one-night stands. It wasn't that men didn't like her. They did, but they were such hard work and she bored easily. She was feeling more than a little untethered. Lonely wasn't a word she allowed into her vocabulary. Perhaps it was why she allowed herself to drop her guard a little and agreed to join Portia for coffee after the class. She was far older. 60, Allison decided when she was being kind. Nearer to 70 when she'd had a bad day and wasn't feeling generous. Despite the age difference, 30 or 40 years, and although they had little in common apart from their shared dislike of pomposity, the coffee became a weekly habit, and they became friends. Allison didn't have any others. Circumstances had meant she'd made none in school, and those she'd made in university had dispersed to other cities, other countries. Despite vocal and usually drunken promises to stay in touch, they hadn't. Eventually, she could barely remember their names and wasn't sure she'd recognize them in a crowd. Portia, with her vividly bright red lipstick, sky blue eyeshadow and dramatically arched eyebrows, was amusing, eccentric, and, if her designer clothes, bags and expensive jewellery were any indication, also very wealthy. After coffee the following week, they left the cafe together, Portia chatting away, Allison nodding now and then to indicate she was listening. When a car pulled up in the car park, Portia was still talking. It was only when the car blasted its horn that she turned, her words cut off mid-sentence. Allison was surprised by the change in her friend's expression. From excitedly animated, it had become tight and almost fearful. "There's my darling," Portia said, waving towards the Porsche. The words were at such odds with the tone of her voice that Allison was tempted to ask Portia if there was something wrong. If perhaps she and her husband had had a row. but before she could get the words out, Portia looked towards the car again. "I'd better dash. He hates to be kept waiting." Without another word, he was gone, leaving Allison standing staring after the car in bemusement. The following week, Portia surprised Allison with an invitation to dinner. "Do come," she said. "We'd love to have you." Caught by surprise, Allison felt obliged to say yes. Anyway, she was curious about her new friend's home and husband. The following evening, she followed the directions she'd been given and reached Portia's Kensington home. It was breathtakingly beautiful. Inside, it was equally so. "Come in," Portia said, throwing the front door open wide. "I hope you don't mind, but we wear slippers inside to protect the wooden floors." She pointed to a pair of pink slippers sitting on the polished wooden floor. "They're new, so don't worry. Or you can go barefooted, if you prefer." "Barefooted is fine." Allison kicked off her shoes. "Great. Come on, I'll open a bottle and we can chat while I finish cooking." Portia pushed the door open into the biggest kitchen Allison had ever seen. It was also probably the coldest. All white, shiny cupboards, white tiled floor, white walls. Portia opened the door of the huge American-style fridge and took out a bottle of Prosecco. "This okay?" Allison nodded and perched on a bar stool as Portia peeled the foil from the neck of the bottle and removed the cork with a satisfying pop. She poured into the waiting glasses. "Cheers," she said, tipping her glass against Allison's. "Stuart has some emails to send. He'll join us when he's done." "Cheers." Allison sipped her drink and put the glass down. "You have a lovely home." "It's fabulous, isn't it?" Portia waved a hand around the room. "The decor mightn't exactly be to my taste, but I do love the space, and living in Kensington is amazing." Portia was so exotic, and the decor so incredibly bland. Allison was puzzled. Perhaps the house was rented. "Oh, I see. It's not your place, then?" "No." Portia's smile was forced. "It's Stuart's house. He likes minimalism." She drained her glass and reached for the bottle. "Some more?" Allison, who had barely touched hers, shook her head. Portia filled her own glass and took a mouthful. "When I met Stuart, I was young, poor, aimless. He was older, wiser, and introduced me to a different world." She waved her hand around the room again. "I got all this and more. Accepting we had different tastes seemed a small price to pay." Allison thought she understood. Portia had said older and wiser. She'd left out richer. When Stuart came through the door moments later, she was convinced she was right. He was perhaps 20 years older than Portia, maybe in his 80s. Portia leapt to her feet and laid a hand on Allison's shoulder. "Stuart, this is Allison." For a second, Allison felt on display. Stuart's eyes, cold and hard, in an unattractively piggy face, slid over her with unpleasant intensity. He crossed to her with his hand extended. "Welcome to our home." "Nice to meet you," she said, feeling her hand engulfed in his unusually large one. He held it a fraction too long for her liking as he continued to weigh her up. She must have passed whatever internal criteria he used to judge people, because suddenly his expression became welcoming. Portia fluttered around with a smile on her face. "Bring Allison through to the dining room, Stuart. I'll bring the food in a mo." "Certainly, my dear." He smiled and waved Allison to a doorway on the far side of the room. It opened into another large, cold room. A huge table was surrounded by 8 chairs. One painting hung on the far wall. There was no other furniture, none of the knickknacks that turned a house into a home. Stuart held a chair out for her, only taking his hands away after she'd sat. Allison thought she'd felt his fingers brush her neck and jerked, startled. But when she looked at him, his expression was one of innocence. Perhaps she'd imagined the touch. It was this house. It was strangely creepy. When Stuart took the seat opposite, she searched for something to say. "You have a lovely home." It was a whopper of a lie, but it worked, and Stuart smiled and sat back. "Minimalism suits me." He waved a hand around the room. "Clean lines, cool colours, no clutter." Portia came bustling through with plates and dishes a moment later, and the room was filled with the aroma of good food. Wine flowed a little too freely for Allison's liking. She left hers untouched when it was refilled and sipped from her water glass instead. As Portia and Stuart imbibed several glasses of wine, the conversation became a little risque. Perhaps if Allison had drunk as much, she might have found it entertaining instead of boring and verging on the unacceptable. She sat back with a forced smile and nodded when appropriate. When Stuart began to put his wife down with subtle, cutting comments as the night progressed, and Portia, normally chatty and effusive, became restless, almost on edge, Allison was glad to escape. "Stay over," Portia insisted at the end of the night. "We've plenty of space after all, and Amy's room is always kept made up in case she should arrive home unexpectedly." There was a hint of longing in the words. Allison knew about Amy, Portia's daughter who'd left home the year before to attend university abroad. She obviously missed her. Was that why she pushed the friendship with Allison? Was she a substitute daughter? "No, thanks," she said. "Actually, I ordered a taxi earlier. It should be here." She checked her phone for the time. "Any moment now." "Oh, that's a shame." Portia looked so genuinely disappointed that Allison felt a moment's regret until she looked at Stuart, whose expression had reverted back to the coldly assessing one. "Next time, perhaps," he said, getting to his feet. "Perhaps." She smiled non-committedly and followed the couple to the hallway, where she slipped her feet into her shoes and took her jacket from Portia. "It's been lovely, thank you so much." "A pleasure, my dear." Portia gave her a quick hug. "We'll do it again soon, and I'll see you in class next week." Allison held a hand out to Stuart and offered yet another of her collection of social lies. "It was lovely to meet you." He took her hand, but instead of shaking it as convention dictated, he pulled her into his arms and a lingering embrace. His body was soft. She felt herself sinking into it. "I look forward to seeing you again," he said before releasing her. As the taxi negotiated London streets to her home, Allison thought about the couple. Portia, she guessed, had married for money, not love, and it had got her what she obviously wanted. Allison rested her head back and shut her eyes. And as she relaxed on the journey home, an idea flickered. Marry for money. Could she do the same? Chapter 7. The idea burrowed itself into her head, but it would probably have died without germinating had she not met Peter less than 2 weeks later. Then it suddenly sprouted. If he was as wealthy as he appeared, could she make it work? Could she really marry for money? She read enough gossip columns to know it was done far more frequently than people like to admit. As Allison allowed Peter to guide her along the pavement, the idea became more appealing. Portia had done it, and it had worked out okay for her. Allison shivered when she thought of Stuart. No, that was a step too far. Peter, however, seemed charming, and he was undeniably handsome. When they reached the underground garage, she half expected the car to be something flashy, something that went with Peter's confident swagger. A Porsche, maybe even a Lamborghini. But when he clicked his remote, she had to bite back the snort of disbelief when the lights of a Ford Fiesta flicked once. Such a reliable, sensible, mundane car. She was amused at her disappointment. It also made her regard Peter with renewed interest. In her limited experience, it was unusual and refreshing to meet a man who didn't need a big, showy car to confirm his masculinity. He opened the door for her, and she slid inside. Okay, where to? She gave him her address. It's kind of you to drop me home. I hope it's not too much out of your way. I have a place in Islington. He reversed the car from the space and headed toward the exit. I don't normally drive, but I had to visit a housebound client who lives in Watford, so it was easier. I don't keep a car myself. No point in telling him she couldn't afford to. Living in London was crazily expensive, and she hadn't been one of the lucky ones who'd been able to combine college with a part-time job. It had taken every hour of study to get her through and enable her to finish in the top 5% of her class. She'd hoped it would pay off, that she'd have her pick of positions when she'd finished. It hadn't quite worked out that way. With her salary adequate rather than good, it had taken far longer than she'd hoped to pay off her student loans. She had hoped to buy her own place, but fast as she saved, property prices continued to rise out of her grasp. Even using a Help to Buy scheme, she would only have been able to afford a tiny apartment somewhere she didn't want to live. The car swayed as Peter negotiated the winding exit from the multi-storey car park. Allison had had a tiring day, and the unaccustomed alcohol was taking its toll. Her eyelids drifted shut and flew open again, only to slowly shut again seconds later. How embarrassing it would be to fall asleep. She shuffled to a more upright position, determined to stay alert, and rattled her brain for something to say. You're a very restful woman to be with. Peter glanced her way as his window slid open at the exit. He pushed the parking card into the slot, and the barrier rose. Before he drove forward, he took his hand from the steering wheel and rested it briefly on her thigh. Most women fill the silence with chattering about nothing. Most women. Allison bridled and would have made a sarcastic comment if the alcohol hadn't dimmed her ability to formulate a sentence. Luckily for him, she could no longer fight against the soporific effect of the car's motion, and fell asleep. When she woke, she was outside her apartment block, his hand gently shaking her shoulder. She looked at him, struggling to remember why she felt momentary irritation. Hadn't he said something to annoy her? Then he leaned forward and kissed her gently on the lips, and she thought she must have imagined it. I'll walk you to your door, he said, reaching to undo her seatbelt. He waited till they reached her apartment on the 4th floor, took her keys from her and inserted them into the lock, pushing the door open and handing the keys back. Will you be okay? She smiled sleepily, drunkenly. Yes, thank you. I'd like to see you again. He leaned forward and, this time, planted a soft kiss on her cheek. You have my card. Ring me. She waited till she saw him vanish into the lift before she shut the door. Ring me. There was no doubt of it. Chapter 8. The following day, Allison took out Peter's business card and flicked it against her nail as she wondered whether to ring him or not. He'd seemed the perfect choice, or had she been affected by the glow of alcohol? The crippling hangover she'd woken with eased after a couple of paracetamols and several glasses of water. She was wrapped in a robe, curled up on her living room sofa with a mug of coffee. To ring or not to ring? That was the question. There were definite pros. He was handsome, entertaining, wealthy. Single? Maybe. It was always hard to tell. She did a quick internet search. Armed with his business card, it was easy. He had a plain, no-nonsense website with business information addressing his qualifications, condensed into a few lines. His speciality was commercial law. Apart from contact details, that was it. No personal details whatsoever. A check on various social media platforms proved to be a waste of time. In his line of work, she wasn't surprised he favoured privacy, but it was irritating. Tossing her phone to one side, she cupped her fingers around the almost empty mug. She'd been flattered. What woman wouldn't be? But wasn't it a bit stalkerish for him to have followed her upstairs from the pub, gate-crashing the party in order to do so? More concerning was his controlling behaviour coupled with a definite tendency to override her wishes. Perhaps it was a hangover from his chosen profession, but even his final "ring me" was somewhat dictatorial. Allison lifted the mug and drained it. If she was serious about this blossoming idea to marry for money, wasn't she being overly fussy? With her social life a non-starter, it was hard to meet men. Harder to meet decent ones. Peter seemed both decent and suitable, and, as such, was worth considering. Tossing the card onto the table, she got to her feet. Time to get on with daily living. She decided to call him, but left it until the Monday afternoon. No point in looking too keen. She'd half expected to have to leave a message, surprised into silence when her call was answered after one ring. "Hi," she said on a long exhale, grasping for the correct words. "It's Allison. I'm having a hell of a day and wondered if you'd like to meet after work for a drink." After work. She would get away with going as she was and had chosen to wear the best she had for that very reason. "Allison, how lovely to hear from you. Yes, that sounds like a wonderful idea. Where were you thinking?" They agreed on a rendezvous spot and she hung up, satisfied. When she walked into their chosen venue, a quiet pub Allison had heard one of her colleagues recommend, he was already there, seated in a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance. She saw him immediately and felt her colour rise as she lifted a hand in greeting.